Now, can you see we now need to know what happens to this lymphatic fluid, which is flowing away from normal tissues, infected tissues, and indeed potentially malignant tissues. So what we end up with is, can you see these vessels here are coming away from the tissue spaces. So we've got a few vessels here, and we know that these are called afferent lymphatic vessels, but we're not sure why they're called afferent lymphatic vessels. But what they do have is they do have valves in them. So these vessels have valves in them. And these valves, if we look at a blow-up, these valves, what we want is the fluid to go from here down to here, but not go back again. So the valves are pointing in this direction, like that. So they will let the lymphatic fluid through from there, can go through. But if it is to try and go back, the valve will close and not let it go back. So these valves are working like this. They're opening like that to let the fluid through, but then they close and don't let it back again. So we end up with a unidirectional flow of lymphatic fluid through the afferent lymphatic vessels in this case. Now throughout the body, some are a bit isolated, but most are in clusters, things called lymph nodes. Throughout the body there's lymph nodes. And throughout the body there's, 500 or 600 lymph nodes. Some of them are very small, some of them might only be 1 millimetre across, others might be bigger. So we normally say 1 to 25 millimetres, 1 to 2.5 centimetres. So some of them are tiny, but others are a bit bigger, these lymph nodes. So for example, in your armpit you've got quite a few lymph nodes, the axillary lymph nodes. In your groin you've got quite a lot of lymph nodes. And then there's lymph nodes around about the large blood vessels inside the chest. So there's clusters of lymph nodes in various parts of the body, adding up to 500 or 600 individual lymph nodes throughout the body. Now, here we have this, can you see this is an afferent lymphatic vessel here? Right? So this diagram is now on a bigger scale, so these are afferent vessels here. And we know these have got valves in that lets the fluid flow in this direction. So this is now the direction away from the tissues. And what these afferent lymphatic vessels, several lymphatic vessels, 3, 4, 5, 6 lymphatic vessels, afferent lymphatic vessels, will flow into one of these structures, which is a lymph node. So these vessels are flowing into a lymph node. So this lymph node might be 1 centimetre or 2 in diameter. Might be in your armpit, might be in your groin, might be an internal one. There it is, it's a lymph node. And coming out of the lymph node, there's only going to be 1 or 2 vessels draining out of the lymph node, and these are called efferent. Efferent lymphatic vessels. So afferent lymphatic vessels are draining lymphatic fluid into a lymph node, and efferent lymphatic vessels are draining fluid out of a lymph node. And again, these efferent lymphatics are going to have valves because we want the fluid to flow out of the lymph node in this direction, but we don't want it to flow back in. So can you see that all of this lymphatic fluid that's being drained from the tissues is being channeled through afferent lymphatics into lymph nodes. It's all going through lymph nodes before draining in efferent lymphatic vessels. Now in this lymph nodes, you've got lots of fine fibres, mostly made of collagen. You've got huge numbers of very fine fibres. And these are called reticular fibres. Reticular fibres. Because they form a reticulum. And a reticulum is a net. So they form a network of very fine protein strand fibres throughout the lymph node. So there's a network of reticular fibres in the lymph node. Reticular.
Yeah.
R-E-T-I-C.
Oh, crikey, it's there.
Yeah.
Sorry, John.
U-L-A-R.
Sorry, John.
It forms a reticulum, a network. So reticular always means network.
What's that measurement there?
This is the size of the lymph nodes. So some of these are going to be 1 millimetre across.
Okay.
Some are going to be as big as 2.5 centimetres across.
That's the range.
Yeah, yeah. So they vary a bit. So, you know, 1 centimetre, 1 to 2 centimetres would be fairly typical. So we've got this network in here. So can you see this network is essentially forming a sieve? It's like a 3-dimensional sieve, a very fine network. So if bacterial cells come into here, they'll be caught out in this sieve. They'll be filtered out and will get stuck in the reticular structure of the lymph node. Or even sometimes cancer cells might be washed down away from the tissues, and they too can get stuck in these reticular fibres. So what this means is the infection, instead of being in the tissues, the infection has now been washed away and it's stuck. It's stuck in this reticular system inside the lymph node, which is kind of good because it's away from the tissues. But can you see all this has really done is it's transferred the infection away from your thumb to your armpit where the lymph nodes are. So can you see we're not a lot better off really. So what we've got inside these lymph nodes are huge numbers of white blood cells. The leukocytes are the white blood cells. They're not in the blood now, they're in the lymph nodes. But there's huge numbers of leukocytes in the lymph nodes. So, for example, as we know, there are lymphocytes. There are macrophages. Macrophages are big cells that specialise in eating bacteria and infection. And there's other types of white blood cell in here as well. And the business that white blood cells are in is defending the body against infection. White blood cells are the mainstay of our immune system. So macrophages, for example, will eat bacteria. What do we call the process where bacteria are gobbled up?
Phagocytosis.
Yeah. So macrophages will physically eat and digest bacteria. There's different sorts of lymphocytes. Some lymphocytes will actually kill cancer cells. The lymphocytes that will kill cancer cells are called cytotoxic. Cyto means cell, they are toxic to cancer cells. Other lymphocytes will recognise the presence of bacterial and viral infections. And when they recognise the presence of bacterial and viral infections, they will make immune proteins. Immune proteins to fight the infection. And the immune proteins are called antibodies. Specific proteins that will fight and result in the death of bacteria and viruses.
What produces the antibodies, please?
The antibodies are produced by the lymphocytes. The lymphocytes are cells that produce antibodies. And we have other immune cells in here that play particular roles in fighting infection.
Is that where you find the swell up in
Yeah, it is, exactly, well done. Yeah, that's exactly what happens. So if you get lots of bacteria coming in here, these bacteria are going to divide, causing a bit of an infection in your lymph node. But the body's immune cells will also divide and proliferate, greatly increasing in numbers. So you've got the white cells that are necessary to eradicate the infection. So you've got the antibodies that are necessary to eradicate the infection. And that may well mean, yes, that when the lymph node is dealing with an infection, it's going to swell up. And it may even become a bit painful because the bacteria can cause inflammation. So in infection, you can get swollen lymph nodes. And this is called lymphadenopathy.
Swollen lymph nodes. That's
Yeah. Lymph and you know that pathy means disease of, don't you? So lymphatic system, lymph, disease of, pathy. And the middle part is adeno. A-D-E-N-O, adeno. That's the middle bit. And adeno actually means to do with glands. Actually means to do with glands. Because people still call lymph nodes lymph glands, don't they? You talk about swollen glands. It's actually wrong. they're not lymph glands, they are lymph nodes. Because a gland is something that produces something, doesn't it? And these don't really produce anything. They are filtering, killing areas. That's what they're for. So when people used to think, I don't know, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when people thought that lymph nodes were glands, they made up this term, lymph gland disease. Lymphadenopathy. But in actual fact it's wrong. But hey, we're stuck with it. So swelling of the lymph glands we still call lymphadenopathy. And that could indeed indicate infection. Or, if cancer cells get in here, and the cancer cells divide, can you see that could also cause lymphadenopathy? So swollen, painful glands, that hopefully only lasts for a few days, then it goes away. Can you see that could be infection? But swollen glands that persist over a period of time, especially if those glands start to feel hard, and especially if those glands, they're not glands, they're nodes, especially if the nodes start to feel hard and aren't painful initially, then can you see that could be a cancer, couldn't it? So in a cancer, for example in a breast cancer, the tumour can start there, but then the cells can spread to the axillary lymph nodes where they can be palpated. So the vast majority of times you get lymphadenopathy, it's likely to be infection, but we always have to bear in mind it could be cancer as well. But the swollen nodes that you get with infection tend to be short-lived, where with cancer they're persistent and tend to get bigger. With infection the nodes tend to be painful. With cancer the nodes typically aren't painful, at least in the early stages. So yeah, good question.
Is a lymphocyte a type of leukocyte?
Yes, absolutely. Leukocytes, so in the blood you've got erythrocytes, which are the red cells, and leukocytes, which are the white cells. A lymphocyte is a type of leukocyte. It is a type of white blood cell. As indeed are, well, macrophages were white blood cells before they migrated into the tissues. So in here, can you see we're going to filter out the bacteria, we're going to filter out any infection, and we're going to filter out any malignant cells. So during infection, we can get lots of bacteria in here. These bacteria can start dividing, but fortunately we've got the white blood cells. The white blood cells will eat them and make antibodies to them to allow the immune system to eradicate them. So the lymph nodes are the immune system's trapping and killing grounds. They trap and kill the enemy. It's quite military, isn't it? You trap the enemy in a valley. What do soldiers call? Do you call that your killing area or something? You have a killing ground or something. So you trap them, then you just kill them. You just kill them. Get rid of them. Get rid of these bacteria. So you see, if you're a bacteria, a lymph node is a real lion's den. You're going to get torn apart, you're going to get eaten, you're going to get antibodies made about you, you're going to get eradicated. Bad news if you're a bacteria. Yeah?
If you've got an infection somewhere,
Yeah.
and then somewhere near you get like a lump, is that likely to be cancer?
No. No, the vast majority of times you get lymphadenopathy, it's going to be swelling in the lymph nodes because of the infection. So quite frequently infection will cause swelling in lymph nodes. So sometimes if you've got swelling in your throat, in your pharynx, you can feel lymph nodes under your jaw, can't you? Submandibular lymphadenopathy. So infection is common. But occasionally, if there's a tumour in one part of the body, then you can get spread to the lymphatics as well. But then it tends to be persistent, hard and less painful. Whereas with the infection, it tends to be a shorter lived and the lymph nodes tend to be tender because they're inflamed. So no, it's two completely separate causes of lymphadenopathy. Swollen lymph nodes are most likely to be an infectious cause, thankfully, because we're very good at getting rid of infections. Yeah?
Can you palpate any of the other lymph nodes, just the ones under?
No, all over, in your groin, in your axilla,
So
around the base of your skull.
Comes like the
under
surface
here.
of your skin then,
Yeah, well,
So you have to feel
they're fairly superficial anyway, and if they swell, then you can feel them. They become palpable. So normally, if you feel your armpit now, you don't have to do it in pleasant company, but you know, when next time you're in the bath, if you have a good feel around your armpit, you won't be able to feel any lymph nodes. Normally they are not palpable. So lymph nodes are normally small and soft and non-palpable. But when they become infected, or when they're trapping cancer cells and you get a lymphadenopathy, then they can become palpable.
When you get cancer of the lymph nodes, is it only specific lymph nodes that can be in large?
If you get a cancer in one part of the body, initially it's the regional lymph nodes that are affected. So if you've got cancer in this breast, you would expect those nodes to be affected. Now later on it can spread, but that's what you'd expect initially. Regional lymph node enlargement. If you're a bacteria, this is a complete lion's den, you're going to get killed. So a lot of the time, the fluid in the afferent lymphatics is going to be sterile anyway, because it's draining sterile tissues. But then occasionally, if you get an infection, it's going to be draining bacteria and potentially viruses. They're going to get trapped in there. So even if there is an infection here, that infection gets killed in the lymphatic system, killing ground here. And that means that the lymphatic fluid draining in the efferent lymphatics should be sterile. It should be sterile. All the infection should be eradicated in the lymph nodes by the body's immune system.
Will there still be bacteria left at that site?
There will,
All good.
but a lot of them will drain away. And as well as that, cells, the white cells, as well as the bacterial cells drain into the lymphatics, white cells will also be attracted to the area of infection and will fight the infection locally. So the infection is fought in the lymphatics, and also the infection is fought locally. So we've got two places we can attack the infection.
So where does that sterile fluid go then, John, after it's been...
Well that's the next part of the story. So we've gone from the tissue spaces, haven't we, into the lymph nodes. Now we're going to have to think of something to do with this tissue fluid. If there's a local infection, for example, first of all, lots of neutrophils will be attracted to that infection. Neutrophils are a type of white blood cell that will, again, phagocytose. And then later, lots of monocytes will be attracted to the infection, and they will become macrophages in the tissue, and that will gobble up, will phagocytose the infection. So it's the white blood cells working here, and it's the white blood cells working here, but this is good because it traps it and it compartmentalises the infection, and it stops it spreading to other parts of the body. Now, once the fluid has gone out of the efferent lymphatics, can you see it needs to go somewhere, doesn't it? So what happens is that efferent lymphatics, so after you've been through the lymph nodes, we're going to get several efferent lymphatic vessels, and they're going to come together and they're going to form still larger vessels, and these larger vessels are called lymphatic trunks. Lymphatic trunks. So the larger lymphatics are called lymphatic trunks. And again, we've still got the valve, so the fluid is moving in the right direction. So we end up with much larger vessels called lymphatic trunks. Now, what you have you might know you've got a large vein in your neck. Large vein in your neck, and this vein is under your clavicle, and it's called your subclavicular vein. So there's a vein under your clavicle there. And of course there's another vein that drains down your neck that you can see when people are lying down, especially, called the jugular vein. So we have these large veins. This is called, actually, we tend to call it the subclavian vein rather than the subclavicular vein. So we've got a subclavian vein there under the clavicle. And that's the jugular vein coming down from the neck. And then this is going to go back, take the blood back to join the superior vena cava. And what happens is that the lymphatic trunks, the trunks join up and they form one large lymphatic duct. And this lymphatic duct goes back into the blood about here at the junction between the jugular and the subclavian vein. So the trunks are draining into the duct. So what's happening is the lymphatic fluid starts off in the lymphatic capillaries. They're drained into the afferent lymphatic vessels. The lymph then filters through the lymph nodes. That's drained in efferent lymphatic vessels. The efferent lymphatic vessels form still larger vessels called lymphatic trunks. And then these lymphatic trunks drain back into the very large lymphatic vessels called lymphatic ducts. And there's only two lymphatic ducts. There's one on this side and there's one on this side. So the sterilised fluid, or at least certainly hope it's sterilised, the sterilised fluid that's draining from the efferent lymphatics is going to drain into larger lymphatic trunks. That's going to drain into larger lymphatic ducts. And that's eventually going to drain this lymphatic fluid back into the venous circulation. So there's a lymphatic duct on this side of the body, draining into the left subclavian and jugular vein, and there's a lymphatic duct on this side of the body, draining into the junction between the jugular and the subclavian vein. So all this lymphatic fluid, about 3 litres a day, that's going through the lymphatic system, is all draining back in through these lymph ducts, back into the venous circulation of the blood.
Does that just contain tissue fluid and proteins?
Proteins
still in it?
Yes. Actually, it's a bit more complicated because lymphatics also drain the gastrointestinal tract. So you might remember that the fatty material that drains from the gastrointestinal tract goes into the lymphatics, and that drains into the left lymphatic duct. But the one that drains into the right lymphatic duct should just contain, escape proteins and lymphatic fluid. Because all of the bacteria should be filtered out here. So can you see we've got a complete additional circulatory system. This fluid that's draining back into the venous system here has come all the way from the blood capillaries into the interstitial space, into the lymphatic capillaries, into the afferent lymphatics, through the lymph nodes, into the efferent lymphatic vessels, into the lymphatic trunks, into the lymphatic ducts, before finally getting back into the blood again. And then it's free to do the whole thing all over again, isn't it? Because it's now drained back into the venous blood. About 3 litres a day does that. Now, I've mentioned one reason why it's important for us to know about this. Because of the risk of infection, lymphadenopathy and cancer. Another problem we come across is lymphedema. Now, edema, as you know, means excessive fluid in the tissue spaces. And if you're from the United States, you don't have the O. You have lymphedema. But for some strange reason in England we still put no in it. So I'm going to put it back in. So, lymphedema is the presence of excess lymphatic fluid in the tissue spaces. It shouldn't be there. So areas of the body can become lymphadematous whenever the lymphatic vessels are not working properly. So in some parts of the world you might get parasitic infections that block up the lymphatics. And the limbs can blow up and it can look like an elephant foot instead of a human foot. It's called elephantiasis. Greatly blown up limbs as a result of parasites living in the lymphatic vessels. Or there can be a bacterial infection which damages the lymphatic vessels. So some people unfortunately develop swelling in one leg compared to the other because the lymphatic vessels in one leg can be damaged by infection. Or sometimes the lymphatic vessels can be damaged by trauma. They can be physically damaged, especially after surgery, especially after orthopaedic trauma or orthopaedic surgery, where the lymphatic vessels can be damaged. So it's important to know about because of lymphadenopathy, which can indicate infection or potential malignancy. It's important to know about because we can get lymphedema, causing swelling in one part of the body. But I think you've seen what this is really about, is about immunity. This is really about the ability of the body to resist infection. So immunological cells live in the lymphatic system. If any bacteria get into the lymphatic system, it's the killing ground. That means we can keep the body tissues sterile. That means we don't have infection. We keep the tissue sterile.